back. So in this lecture, we'll cover the definition of stress, stress appraisal, and the effects of chronic stress on physical health. So the definition of stress is that it's a constellation of events that begins with a stressor. And a stressor is any event or environmental demand that challenges or threatens us. And it could be something external like a deadline or something internal like worrying about a health issue. Once a stressor is perceived, it often triggers a negative emotional response. So it may trigger anxiety, frustration, or fear. And that emotional reaction is part of what makes stress feel uncomfortable or overwhelming. And so stress then, if the situation is appraised as stressful or threatening, the body then activates its fight or flight response. So our sympathetic nervous system kicks in, our hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are released, and our heart rate starts to increase, our muscles get tense, and our energy is mobilized. And this response prepares the body to either confront the threat or escape it. So there are three different stress appraisals. The first one is primary appraisal, and that refers to understanding what an event is and what it's going to mean. Is it going to be harmful, threatening, or challenging to us? We also appraise stress through secondary appraisal, which means we assess whether personal resources are sufficient to meet the demands of the environment. And then lastly, personal environment fit results from the process of appraising events, assessing potential resources, and responding to the events. Historically, stress was considered as entirely physiological. So it was based on Walter Cannon's fight or flight response. So fight or flight response is this internal built-in mechanism we all have in combating something threatening to our survival. And so when we're confronted with a situation that is threatening our safety or dangerous or promoting fear, fright, or stress or anger, our fight or flight response kicks in. And so the point of that is for our body to take care of that event and meet the environmental demands and protect our survival. And so it's a survival instinct, and it also allows us to maintain homeostasis. And so homeostasis is this internal environment in which physiological variables such as our blood pressure, our respiration, and our temperature are stabilized at levels optimal for our survival. And so one of the advantages of a stress response is that it's adaptive. It allows us to survive. Stress induces the ability to respond quickly to a threat. However, the disadvantage of stress is that over time, when we're under high levels of stress that continue long term, our fight or flight response is then constantly in the works. And so over time, when you have a constantly active fight or flight response, it can disrupt functioning, it can alter our body, and result in health problems. Hans Selye was a medical doctor and researcher, and he came up with the theory of the general adaptation syndrome. He did a rat experimental study at McGill University in Montreal, and he observed a series of physiological changes in rats after they were exposed to stressful events. So these stressors that the rats were exposed to produced physiological changes and mobilized them for action. And he concluded that these changes were not an isolated case, but rather the typical response to stress. And so he identified these stages as alarm reaction, resistance, and the exhaustion stage. So the alarm reaction stage is the fight or flight response to stress. And so all of these stages are what people go through in response to a stressor. The alarm reaction fight or flight response is the initial response to stress. So this natural reaction prepares us to either flee or protect ourselves in dangerous situations. During this stage, our heart increases, our heart rates, Our adrenal gland releases cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and we receive a boost of adrenaline, which increases our energy so that we can flee or fight. And so this is what's going on in our alarm reaction stage. In the resistance stage, which happens after the initial shock of a stressful event, our body begins to repair itself. So it will release a lower amount of cortisol, and our heart rate and blood pressure will begin to stabilize again. So this is where our body really tries to maintain homeostasis, the normal level, in order to optimize our survival. In this stage, our body goes through changes that we're typically unaware of in an attempt to cope with stress. So it's really about coping. And then the third stage is the exhaustion stage. This is resulting from prolonged or chronic stress. So when we're struggling with stressful situations for long periods of time, it can drain our resources to the point where our bodies are no longer able to fight stress. So our strength is depleted. Our resources are depleted. So signs of this stage include fatigue, burnout, depression, anxiety, and decreased stress tolerance. And we can also start to notice physical effects of this stage because the constant stress can also weaken our immune system and put us at risk for stress-related illnesses. So the main criticism of the general adaptation syndrome is that it assigns a limited role to psychological factors. So as more research has been conducted on stress, researchers are now beginning to understand that the psychological appraisal of events is critical to experiencing stress. It plays a crucial role in how somebody experiences stress and how they respond physiologically to stress. The general adaptation syndrome is really based on these physiological events, and stress, as we know, is not all physiological. A lot of psychological factors go into how one is going to experience stress. So stress is really a multidimensional concept. Stress really depends on how a person evaluates the stressor, known as perceived stress. So that's a more subjective way of evaluating stress. And then objective ways of stress of our major life events. So the number of life events somebody experiences, what somebody considers to be major or not major, and a whole variety of individual differences that play a role. So not all stressors produce the same biological responses because of individual differences. So there's personality differences that could play a role in how somebody experiences stress. There's also prior experience to stress that can even influence future stress. There's emotion, so how emotionally susceptible somebody is to feeling stress. Are they going to get angry? Are they going to be sad? Are they more likely to be fearful? Sensitivity to stress also plays a role. So how sensitive somebody is to environmental changes can create biological responses that maybe somebody that has low sensitivity to stress may not have. And then lastly, stress reactivity, which is the degree of change that can occur from stress. So not everybody experiences the same degree of change resulting from a stressor. And so this is the main criticism of this theory, is that psychological factors are not being accounted for in somebody's experience of stress. Other criticisms of the general adaptation syndrome is that it fails to address the debilitating effects of stress. So it just, addresses the fact that people grow exhausted, but it doesn't really tell you what health consequences come along with being under chronic amounts of stress. The theory also leaves out other ways in which people can respond to stress. So people don't just merely fight or flee, resist, and grow exhausted. There's other responses that people can have and other coping mechanisms that they can have to stress. The 10 and befriend theory expands upon the general adaptation syndrome, and says that in addition to fight or flight responses, people and animals respond to stress with social affiliation and nurturant behavior towards offspring. And so, under conditions of stress and threat, we tend to look to others for protection and comfort, and we look for social support. And this is because oxytocin is released during stressful events, and it can act as an impetus for affiliation. Stress can cause illness by altering our biological functioning, particularly weakening our immune system. It can also cause poor health habits and behaviors to form in order to cope with stress. And then that can influence our risk of disease or getting a chronic condition later on in life. Stress also affects our psychosocial functioning and how we interact with others, and it can also cause delayed use of health services and treatment adherence. Stress can have a number of direct and indirect effects on our health. Direct physiological effects include elevated lipids, elevated blood pressure, decreased immunity, and increased hormonal activity. Stress also causes health behavior changes to form. So people that smoke and have alcohol usually increase smoking and alcohol when under stress. It can also decrease nutrition intake. So people under high stress are more likely to consume high-fat foods and high-carb foods. Stress is also associated with reduced sleep, increased drug use, and poor diet and low physical activity. Stress is regulated by two systems known as the sympathetic adrenomedullary system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The sympathetic adrenomedullary system is a sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, and it activates initial responses to stress. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis includes the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. During stress, the sympathetic nervous system becomes aroused and it stimulates the medulla of the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands secrete the catecholamines, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. The hypothalamus releases the corticotropin-releasing hormone, and that stimulates secretion of adrenocorticotropic hormones. The adrenocorticotropic hormones stimulate the release of glucocorticoids, and that conserves stores of carbohydrates. And then so repeated activation of the hypopituitary adrenal axis will compromise its functioning because it alters cortisol levels, which can influence immune function and response. So the allostatic load theory refers to the cumulative burden of chronic stress and life events. And so this theory states that chronic stress causes wear and tear on the body by inducing physiological costs that come with chronic exposure to physiological changes from repeated stress. And so our several physiological systems, when they're working repeatedly towards consistently high or non-adaptive states in the environment, this exceeds our resources. And so this results in allostatic overload. So allostasis is a change of our body's physiological systems in response to repeated exposure to stress. And our repeated attempts to adapt to this environmental demand, and if our resources are depleted and cannot exceed the capacity to cope, this results in overload, and this is very taxing on our health and our bodies. And so this theory then posits that these physiological costs incurred can increase health risks and cause disease. Indicators of allostatic load are increased weight gain, higher blood pressure, and shorter telomeres, which is linked to accelerated aging. Some psychosocial resources that serve as protective effects of adverse outcomes due to stress are self-esteem, optimism, and social support. So people with higher self-esteem, optimism, and have social support are more likely to have better coping mechanisms to deal with stress, and so they're less likely to suffer adverse outcomes or health issues due to stress. Eustress is referred to as positive stress. And so it's the idea that one reacts to stressors with positive emotions instead of negative emotions. Eustress tends to be acute or short-lived and is perceived as something we can manage. It results in positive health outcomes such as improved performance, improved mental function and memory, and promoting healing. So how to differentiate what is good stress versus bad stress? Well, from what we learned so far in this chapter, we know that bad stress, also known as negative stress, is chronic and it causes us distress. So if it's stress that is causing us repeated distress, is repeatedly exceeding and depleting our resources, and over time creating health issues, and over time exceeding our capacity to cope, then it is bad stress. Whereas with good stress, this is the type of stress that is acute and short-lived. It helps challenge us, and it also results in positive health outcomes instead of negative ones. Good stress is not chronic, and so that is the main difference. If it's stress that is long-lived, permanent, or causing repeated amounts of distress and consistently exceeding our capacity to cope and depleting our resources, that is negative stress. Now, another thing to consider is appraisal. And so the boundary between good stress and bad stress also has to do with how we perceive the stressor. Do we perceive it as a threat or a challenge? And so if we perceive it as more of a challenge and less of a threat, then we can conclude that it's more positive stress. But if we see it as threatening, frightening, or inducing fear or harm, it's more bad stress than good stress.